Imagine stumbling across photographs that shouldn't exist, images hidden for decades, showing boys who were never born, never registered, and never buried. Yet there they were, haunting faces frozen in time, two lads standing in front of a dilapidated cabin on a forgotten ridge in Appalachia. Their names? Nowhere to be found. Their faces? Mirrored so perfectly it was as if someone had tried to replicate them, but failed. These children, known only as the Mirror Children, carry a chilling mystery that stretches deep into the forgotten corners of Appalachia. There's a family that no one can confirm existed, yet their presence lingers, a ghost story woven into the very land. What happened in Hollow Ridge is not just a tale told by firelight, but a haunting truth that refuses to stay buried. And trust me, once you learn about it, you might just start walking a little differently in the woods. Stay with me, because this story is darker and stranger than anything you've heard before. Before we dive deeper into the eerie tale of the Mirror Children, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who loves mysteries that linger long after the lights go out. You don't want to miss what's coming next. In the spring of 1939, after the floods ravaged Leslie County, a group of men was assigned to clean out the courthouse basement, tasked with salvaging any records they could. Their job was simple but important. Amidst the damp, disintegrating records, one item stood out: a photograph, hidden deep within a warped filing drawer. The edges were curled and damaged, as though it had been intentionally stashed away, unseen by most. The photo depicted two boys, standing side by side before an old, crumbling cabin. Their faces were strikingly similar, their expressions blank. They were not twins, yet they looked as though they were two parts of the same whole. The man who found the photo, David Brown, logged it simply as unknown children, possible homestead case. But something about it unsettled him. The boys' eerie resemblance seemed to demand an answer that no one could provide. The photograph resurfaced again in 1951, discovered in a pile of old materials at a local historical society. The same haunting faces stared back at whoever dared to look. The mystery only deepened with time. By the 1980s, the boys had become part of local legend. Locals began calling them the Mirror Children, a name that stuck, though no one could explain why the boys were always together or why they were so unsettling. Jonas Felder, a retired postman, recalled seeing the boys years before. He remembered them standing motionless near the cabin. They weren't twins, he said. They were like copies of each other, but something was off. Jonas's description echoed through the town. The boys were not identical, but their faces mirrored each other in a way that made them seem unnatural. They weren't quite the same, yet they shared an uncanny resemblance. The boys never spoke. They never interacted with anyone. They stood together side by side, like two silent statues frozen in time, their presence unnerving all who saw them. No one could explain their stillness. Locals spoke of a strange stillness that hung around the cabin. The air around it was thick with an unnatural quiet, a presence that seemed to belong to another world. People who ventured too close felt an instinct to retreat. The cabin itself, abandoned and decaying, seemed to hold a secret no one dared uncover. It was as if the boys belonged there, as if they were the last vestiges of something ancient, something that refused to leave. Coraline Ashcraftoft, the woman who was linked to the cabin, had disappeared from all public records in the early 1920s. Her name was removed from church registers, and no one knew where she had gone or why. Rumors circulated that Coraline had hidden the boys, protecting them from something dark. But no one knew the truth. The questions surrounding the boys grew more pressing, but no one dared to speak them aloud. By the 1950s, more men had seen the boys near the cabin. They were always together, standing still, never straying far from the cabin's decaying walls. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Caleb Drummond, a farmer who lived nearby, recalled riding past the cabin on horseback. He saw the boys standing at the edge of the woods, their eyes locked on him, but they never moved or acknowledged his presence. Despite their stillness, Caleb described the boys' gaze as unsettling. It was as if they could see right through him, though their faces never changed, their expressions never shifted. It was as if they were part of the land itself. In the years that followed, the story of the Mirror Children spread. Men in the area exchanged stories about the boys' strange behavior and the eerie quiet that surrounded them. The mystery only deepened with each retelling. By the 1960s, men who dared to get close to the cabin reported a growing sense of dread. The boys remained as they always had, never moving, never changing, their faces locked in an eternal state of stillness. No one understood why the boys were never seen apart, why they always moved together, or why they were so unsettling. But it was clear to all who saw them. These boys were not like other children. Something was wrong with them. The land around the cabin seemed to hold its breath, and many began to believe that the boys were tied to something older, something darker that had been buried in the woods of Hollow Ridge for generations. The legend of the Mirror Children continued to haunt Leslie County, woven into the fabric of local lore. No one could explain the boys, nor the dark presence that clung to Hollow Ridge. They were a mystery with no answers, only whispers. As the decades passed, the legend of the Mirror Children became more than just a local story. It grew into something that men feared and whispered about in taverns, around campfires, and in hushed voices after dusk. By the 1950s, the boys had become a symbol of something strange in the land. There was always talk of the cabin, of Coraline Ashcraftoft, and of the boys' eerie stillness. But no one dared get close enough to uncover the truth. Local hunters had long avoided the ridge. They spoke of a presence in the air, something unsettling, something that made the woods feel wrong. No animal dared to enter the area, and men spoke of the strange silence that clung to Hollow Ridge. Some of the braver souls who ventured close spoke of a heavy stillness. It wasn't just that the area was quiet, it was oppressive, like the land itself was waiting, watching. The trees seemed to shift unnaturally in the wind, as if they were alive. One hunter, Wallace Given, described the feeling as if the air itself was watching him. "It's like someone was waiting for me to make a move," he said, recalling how he had never been able to stay near the cabin for long. Men who dared to stay too long near the cabin spoke of strange occurrences. Some heard footsteps behind them in the leaves, yet when they turned, no one was there. Others felt their breath catch in their throats, like something unseen was breathing with them. A farmer named Marcus Talbot had once walked by the cabin and swore he saw movement in the window. He approached the door, but as he drew closer, he felt a wave of fear so strong it stopped him in his tracks. He turned and left without a word. For years, the cabin stood as an eerie monument to the unknown. No one had dared to investigate further, and the mystery of the Mirror Children deepened with each passing year. The local men had their superstitions, but nothing explained the unexplainable. In 1960, a group of young men, eager to solve the mystery, ventured up the ridge with cameras and notebooks. They were determined to uncover the truth about the Mirror Children. But when they reached the cabin, something in the air made them turn back. The moment they crossed into the area surrounding the cabin, a strange unease settled over them. The woods, which had been full of life just moments before, felt suddenly empty, like the trees were watching them, waiting for them to leave. They reported hearing strange sounds, like whispers carried by the wind, yet when they checked, no one was around. The only thing they could see were the two boys, standing motionless by the cabin, staring at them with their unnerving, identical faces. One of the men, Eli Davenport, was the first to speak. "We need to leave. Now," he said, his voice strained. No one questioned him. They turned and left the ridge, each man too afraid to speak as they hurried down the path. But something had changed. No one could explain it, but the presence of the boys, standing still and silent, lingered in their minds. They returned home, but the fear they had felt followed them, and their courage slowly slipped away with each passing day. In the years that followed, men in Hyden would avoid the ridge altogether. It became a place of whispered warnings, a spot no one dared venture near. It wasn't just superstition that kept people away. It was the fear of what might be hidden in the woods. Local stories began to grow darker. Some said the boys were more than just strange children. Some spoke of them as guardians of the land, protectors of a secret buried deep within the earth, something not meant to be uncovered. The land around the cabin seemed to be tied to something ancient. No one could say exactly what it was, but many began to feel it. An oppressive presence that clung to the ridge, something that made the land feel cursed. Then, in 1968, a young man named Raymond Faulkner, determined to uncover the truth, decided to venture alone to Hollow Ridge. He was the first in years to go there without fear, convinced that the story was just a myth. Raymond never returned. His disappearance was the final catalyst that solidified the cabin's place in local lore. The authorities searched for him, but no trace of Raymond was ever found. The men who had seen him last swore they heard strange sounds, but no one would speak of it aloud. Rumors began to spread that Raymond had encountered something in the woods, something beyond human understanding. His disappearance, along with the strange occurrences at the cabin, confirmed what many had already suspected. Something sinister lingered there. The mystery of the Mirror Children was no longer just a story, it was a warning. It was as if the land itself had claimed the boys and the cabin, and any man who ventured too close would be bound to the same fate. By the late 1970s, Hollow Ridge had become a place to avoid, a place that men spoke of only in hushed tones. The legend of the Mirror Children and the strange happenings surrounding the cabin had become part of the town's dark history. Some believed the boys were ghosts, trapped in a cycle of repetition, unable to escape. Others thought they were the result of something darker, an unholy bond between the boys and the land, a bond that could not be broken. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that the boys were more than a mystery. They were a reminder of something ancient, something dangerous, something that had survived for generations in the heart of the Appalachian woods. And for those who had the courage to venture too close, the legend of the Mirror Children would never be forgotten. It would live on, passed down from one generation of men to the next, each one afraid to uncover the truth. By the early 1950s, the legend of the Mirror Children had spread far beyond Leslie County. But despite the growing stories, no one ever ventured close enough to uncover the truth about the boys and their eerie existence. Local men who had heard the whispers about Hollow Ridge began to avoid the area altogether. It was no longer just superstition. It was fear, the kind of fear that wrapped around you like a cold wind, unshakable. Even the bravest hunters spoke of the land's unnatural silence, a stillness that unnerved them whenever they approached the ridge. They never saw the boys in person, but they felt their presence, as if the boys were always watching. Some men believed the boys were trapped in time, stuck between the living and the dead. Others thought they were the product of an ancient curse, tied to the land, or perhaps the result of some terrible family secret. The fear surrounding Hollow Ridge grew, fueled by the mysterious disappearance of Raymond Faulkner. His vanishing had left a mark on the town, a chilling reminder that not everything in the woods was meant to be uncovered. The boys, always together, never changing, stood as symbols of something beyond human understanding. They became part of the mythos of Appalachia, legends passed down through hushed voices in dimly lit rooms and quiet taverns. Yet no man dared to test the legend. No one wanted to venture into the heart of Hollow Ridge to discover the truth behind the boys and their silent existence. They were a story, and nothing more. However, the fear didn't keep everyone away. A group of young men, eager to challenge the growing myth, decided to hike into the woods in search of answers. They were determined to face the truth no matter what. Their hike took them deeper into the forest than most had ever ventured. They were determined to get to the cabin, to see the boys for themselves. But they hadn't counted on the strange force that seemed to draw them back. The further they went, the quieter the woods became. The birds stopped singing. The wind ceased to rustle through the trees. It was as though the land had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for them to turn back. One of the men, Thomas Hawkins, felt a sense of unease creeping up his spine. He stopped for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. But there was nothing behind him. Nothing but the dense forest that seemed to press in from all sides. They reached the edge of the ridge by late afternoon. The cabin, long abandoned, loomed in front of them, its sagging roof and broken windows a testament to years of neglect. Yet something about it still felt unnaturally solid. The boys were nowhere to be seen. The men stood at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to approach the cabin or turn back. The stillness in the air was suffocating, as if something had waited for them to arrive. Suddenly, one of the men, Edward Price, pointed toward the cabin. "Look," he whispered. The others turned to see two figures standing motionless near the tree line. Their faces were blank, identical, staring at them from the shadows. No one moved. The boys were there, just as the legends had described them. They stood in perfect silence, their identical faces frozen in an expression that sent chills down the spines of the young men. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go, now." But as he turned to leave, the air seemed to grow heavier. The boys hadn't moved, but their presence was more palpable than ever. They made their way back down the ridge, the strange feeling of being watched never leaving them. The boys had never spoken, had never made a sound. But their presence was undeniable, as if they were part of the forest itself. The men hurried back to town, their pace quickening with each step. The woods behind them felt darker, as though the trees had closed in around them, keeping their secrets hidden deep within the heart of Hollow Ridge. By the time they returned to town, the young men were shaken. They didn't speak much of what they had seen. They didn't need to. The fear that had gripped them in the woods was enough to silence them for good. In the years that followed, no one dared venture near Hollow Ridge again. The boys, the cabin, the strange silence that hung in the air, it was all left behind, a mystery that was too terrifying to uncover. And so, the legend of the Mirror Children continued to grow, passed down from one generation of men to the next, always spoken of in hushed tones, never to be fully understood. The story would live on. The legend of the Mirror Children had remained a silent presence in Leslie County, passed from one generation of men to the next. Yet, as time went on, the memories of the boys began to fade. Despite the fear that surrounded Hollow Ridge, there were always men who were driven by curiosity, eager to understand what had been left unspoken. Some believed the boys were a myth, others thought they were a warning. It wasn't until 1979 that a new group of men decided to test the old stories for themselves. They had heard the whispers, seen the photographs, and wondered if there was more to the story of the boys. Led by a local man named Nathan West, the group set out with the intention of uncovering the truth. They were determined to learn what had really happened on Hollow Ridge, even if it meant facing the unknown. Nathan had heard the rumors of the boys for years, but they had always been dismissed as just another piece of folklore. Now, with a few trusted companions, he was ready to see if there was any truth behind them. The men gathered their gear and made their way into the woods, determined to reach the cabin. They had no idea what awaited them, but the pull of the mystery was too strong to resist. They had to know. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The usual sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, faded away. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. No one spoke. No one dared break the stillness that surrounded them. Even the trees seemed to close in, creating an unnerving feeling that they were being watched. Nathan had heard stories of how the land around the cabin seemed to hold something back, a presence that made men uneasy. But nothing had prepared him for the weight of the silence, the unnatural stillness that gripped the ridge. When they reached the clearing near the cabin, the men paused. They could see the decaying structure in the distance, its sagging roof and crooked windows standing like a monument to something forgotten, something no one dared to remember. The boys were not there. For a brief moment, the men thought they might have been mistaken, that the stories were just tales, but as they neared the cabin, the air seemed to grow colder, denser, as if something was shifting. Suddenly they saw them, the two boys, standing by the edge of the forest. Their identical faces were frozen, their eyes locked on the group. They didn't move, didn't blink. They just stood there, watching. For a moment, the men stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The boys' presence was undeniable, but there was no explanation for it. No one had ever been able to explain why they were there, or what kept them bound to the land. Nathan swallowed hard, but the fear that gripped him was not one he could easily dismiss. The boys' faces, identical yet different, seemed to burn into his mind, as if they were a reflection of something darker. As the men hesitated, the atmosphere grew thicker. The boys hadn't moved, but their eyes were fixed on them, unwavering. It felt as though the very land was alive, watching, waiting for them to make the next move. A chill ran down Nathan's spine as he turned to his companions. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and urgent. His warning hung in the air, but no one made a move to leave just yet. They were all caught in the stillness. The boys didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their silence was louder than any words could have been. It was as if the land itself had chosen them, and they had become part of its mystery, part of its curse. Nathan knew they couldn't stay any longer. The air was heavy, thick with an unspoken force. As he began to turn, he noticed something strange. The boys were still watching, but their faces seemed to shift, their expressions unreadable. As they made their way back, the men didn't speak. The forest around them felt darker, as if it had been watching their every move. They hurried down the path, eager to escape the oppressive weight of the ridge. Once they reached the safety of town, the silence remained. They had seen the boys, but they couldn't explain what had happened, what they had witnessed. The Mirror Children were no longer just a story. They were something real, something they couldn't escape. Nathan tried to rationalize it, but the unease that gripped him never faded. The boys, the cabin, the stillness of Hollow Ridge. It was all too much. He had seen it with his own eyes, but it was a truth he couldn't fully grasp. And so, Hollow Ridge became even more of a place to avoid. The boys, silent and motionless, were a reminder that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The land held its secrets tightly, and no man would ever fully understand them. The town of Hyden, though small, had always carried with it a weight of unspoken stories. Stories passed down through generations of men, each one more unsettling than the last. The Mirror Children had become a part of that lore. In 1983, after years of silence, a new piece of the puzzle emerged. A local man, Henry Caldwell, stumbled upon an old, worn journal at an estate sale. It had belonged to Sylvie Kincaid, a social worker who had vanished in the 1950s. Henry had heard of Sylvie's disappearance, but he never thought much of it. Most people believed she had simply wandered off, lost in the wilderness. But the journal, found buried in the back of a dusty box, told a different story. Sylvie had been assigned to a welfare project in Leslie County, her goal to check on the isolated families living in the area. Her work had brought her to Hollow Ridge, where she had made contact with Coraline Ashcraftoft and the boys. The journal, though fragmented and difficult to read, described her first encounter with the boys. Sylvie had been terrified, but she had also been driven by a sense of duty. She had entered the cabin, unafraid of the rumors. According to her journal, the boys had been strange from the start. They were silent, unblinking, and always together. She described their faces as eerily similar, but with an unsettling flaw, as if their faces had been pressed too hard. The entries grew more disturbing as she wrote about her time in the cabin. Sylvie had felt an overpowering sense of isolation, as if the land itself was closing in around her. There was something about the place that made her feel trapped. One of the last entries in the journal spoke of a conversation with Coraline. The woman had spoken in riddles, describing the boys not by name, but as my echoes. The phrase, once read, haunted the men who would later discover it. Sylvie's journal also mentioned how Coraline kept the boys in a state of unnerving stillness. They were fed but never spoke. They moved only when Coraline moved. It was as if they were following some invisible cue, always in perfect sync. As the journal progressed, Sylvie's writing became more erratic. She had started to question her own sanity, wondering if the boys were real or if they were part of some twisted dream she couldn't escape. Her handwriting reflected her growing unease. The last few pages of the journal were nearly unreadable, covered in smudged ink and desperate scribblings. Sylvie had described hearing strange noises at night, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, the trees, and even the ground itself. One entry stood out. Sylvie had written, "They don't need to speak. They are one. I am the only one who blinks." Those words, recorded just before her disappearance, chilled the men who later read them, unable to comprehend their meaning. The journal did not provide any answers to Sylvie's fate. The entries stopped abruptly, and there was no mention of her final moments. Her disappearance remained a mystery, but her journal had left a trail that no man could ignore. The discovery of Sylvie's journal reignited the town's fear of Hollow Ridge. Many believed that Sylvie had uncovered something that should have stayed buried, that her curiosity had led her to a dark truth that no one was meant to know. Some of the older men in the town recalled hearing of Sylvie's work. They whispered about how she had visited Hollow Ridge, how she had spent time with Coraline and the boys, but no one knew what had really happened to her afterward. The journal became an object of obsession for some, a relic from the past that seemed to hold the key to the mystery of the Mirror Children. But as much as the men tried to understand it, they were only left with more questions. Sylvie's fate was tied to the boys, to the cabin, to the land itself. The legend of the Mirror Children had grown darker, now intertwined with the disappearance of a woman who had dared to uncover the truth. Hollow Ridge remained untouched, a place avoided by most. The mystery of the boys was no longer just a local legend. It was a warning, a story of those who had ventured too close and never returned. The journal was passed from man to man, each one hoping it would provide the answers they sought. But it never did. The story of the Mirror Children and of Sylvie's disappearance continued to haunt them, a puzzle that no one could solve. As the years passed, the journal faded from memory, and the fear surrounding Hollow Ridge began to soften. But for those who had read it, the story was far from over. It lingered in the corners of their minds, like a shadow that never left. No one ever truly understood what had happened to Sylvie Kincaid. The truth remained buried in the land, in the cabin, and in the silent faces of the boys. The journal, though a clue, only deepened the mystery, leaving the men with more unanswered questions than ever. In 1954, a series of strange events began to unfold in Leslie County. Hollow Ridge, once a place of whispered warnings, was about to become the site of something far darker than anyone had anticipated. For years, the town had avoided Hollow Ridge, the cabin, and the boys who were always seen there. The land had become a place of fear, untouched by outsiders. But that year, something changed. It began with reports of smoke in the air. It wasn't the thick black smoke of a traditional fire. It was a pale gray, almost ethereal, like steam rising from the earth itself. Some said it smelled of copper and mold. Dorian Langford, A tobacco farmer whose land bordered Hollow Ridge was the first to see it. He described the smoke as strange, unlike anything he had ever encountered. It seemed to come from deep within the ridge. He watched from a distance, uneasy but unable to tear his eyes away. It was only when he noticed that the smoke was concentrated around the old cabin that he decided to investigate further. What he found would change everything. The next day, Dorian notified the local sheriff's office. A small team of men, including a few from the Historical Society, made their way up to the ridge to investigate. What they found was both disturbing and baffling. The cabin, once abandoned and decaying, was now the center of a strange scene. The roof had collapsed inward, and the walls had fallen in on themselves. The fire, if it could even be called that, had burned from the inside out. There were no scorch marks on the trees surrounding the cabin. The underbrush had not been touched by the flames. It was as though the fire had been confined to the cabin itself, consuming only what it needed, leaving everything else untouched. In the ashes, investigators found remnants that should not have survived. A child's leather shoe, its laces melted but the shape still intact, was among the most unsettling discoveries. It was as if something had been trying to escape, but was stopped. There were also pieces of bone, human bone, with no apparent signs of injury or violence. The jawbone found was particularly strange. It was a child's jaw, but unlike any known records in the county, no one could identify it. The prints were strangely undisturbed. Despite the time that had passed since the fire, they remained as sharp and defined as if they had been made only moments before. The men followed them, but they eventually faded into the woods. No adult remains were found. The fire had consumed the cabin, but not a single sign of Coraline Ashcraftoft or the boys remained. It was as if they had vanished, leaving no trace behind. It was as though the land had swallowed them whole. The sheriff's office filed the case away, marking it as an unsolved mystery. There were no answers to be found, and the fire's strange nature only deepened the fear surrounding Hollow Ridge. What had really happened there? As the days passed, word of the fire spread. But it wasn't just the fire that troubled the townsfolk. It was the fact that no one had seen the boys in the days leading up to the blaze. It was as if they had simply disappeared. Local stories began to swirl about the fire. Some said that Coraline had died in the flames, taking the boys with her. Others whispered that the fire had been some sort of ritual, a final act to keep them bound to the land. But no one dared to speak of it openly. Hollow Ridge had become a place that no man wanted to visit, not after what had happened. The legend of the Mirror Children had shifted, becoming something darker, something more dangerous. The fire had burned away the cabin, but it hadn't burned away the fear that clung to the land. The boys were still a mystery, still a presence that lingered, even if their physical forms were no longer there to be seen. Years later, men who had lived through that time would recall the fire in hushed tones, but no one ever ventured back to Hollow Ridge. The land remained untouched, a reminder of something that no one wanted to fully understand. Even the authorities had moved on. The fire and its aftermath were filed away, forgotten like so many other unsolved cases. But for those who had been there, it was a story that never truly ended. In the years that followed, the memory of the Mirror Children remained, but the fear that had once surrounded Hollow Ridge began to fade. New generations of men came and went, never knowing the weight of the legend that had once defined the town. But for those who still remembered, Hollow Ridge was more than just a place on a map. It was a warning, a reminder that some stories should never be explored, some mysteries should never be solved. It was a place where silence spoke louder than words. The fire had burned the cabin to the ground, but it had also scattered the legend of the Mirror Children into the winds. Whether real or imagined, the boys had become a part of the land itself, a presence that would never be erased. As the years passed, the story of the Mirror Children began to fade into the shadows of local history. New generations of men had come and gone, and the fear surrounding Hollow Ridge had softened with time. Yet, despite the years of silence, the legend never fully disappeared. The stories continued to circulate among the older men in town, passed down to anyone willing to listen, but few dared to believe them anymore. By the 1980s, some of the younger men had begun to question the old stories. They dismissed them as nothing more than tall tales, ghost stories told around campfires, meant to scare children but not grounded in reality. But there were still those who remembered, who had witnessed the eerie stillness of Hollow Ridge and the strange boys who had once stood there, frozen in time. For them, the stories never lost their power. One such man, Eli Foster, had heard the tales of the Mirror Children since he was a boy. He had grown up in the area and had always felt an unease when the topic came up, though he had never seen the boys himself. Now, in his late 30s, Eli decided it was time to revisit the legend. He had spent years pushing the fear aside, telling himself it was all fiction. But curiosity, combined with the weight of the past, urged him to return to Hollow Ridge. In 1987, Eli set out on foot, determined to see the cabin and the ridge for himself. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, perhaps answers, or perhaps the reassurance that the stories were just that, stories. The further Eli walked into the woods, the more the memories of the place resurfaced. He remembered the stories his father had told him, about the boys, about the strange silence that hung around Hollow Ridge. He tried to shake off the fear. The trees seemed to close in around him as he ventured deeper into the forest. The path was overgrown, nearly forgotten, but Eli pressed on, determined to find the truth. But the deeper he went, the heavier the silence became. By the time he reached the clearing near the cabin, Eli's heart was racing. He could feel the weight of the land pressing down on him, the same feeling that had plagued the men before him. It was as if the woods had changed since his youth. The cabin, or rather what was left of it, stood before him in its decaying state. The once rotting structure had now collapsed entirely. Nothing but a few charred remnants remained. Yet, something about the site felt wrong. It was too still. Eli approached cautiously, scanning the ground for any trace of the boys or their presence. But the area was empty, silent as ever. There was no sign of movement, no footprints, nothing that suggested anyone had been here in years. Despite the emptiness, Eli felt as though he was being watched. The feeling was unsettling, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. His breath quickened as he scanned the trees, but still there was nothing. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement. Two figures standing by the edge of the trees. Their faces were indistinguishable, but the posture was all too familiar. The boys, still standing, still watching, frozen in time. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. The boys hadn't aged, hadn't moved. They were exactly as the stories had described, their identical faces locked in place. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he was rooted to the spot. For what felt like an eternity, Eli stood frozen, unable to look away from the boys. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, the same feeling that had gripped those who had come before him. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the boys vanished into the trees, leaving Eli standing alone. His breath was shallow, his body trembling with the fear that he had tried to ignore for so long. He turned quickly, deciding it was time to leave. As he made his way back down the ridge, the silence followed him, hanging in the air like a thick fog. The woods felt darker now, as though something had shifted within them. By the time Eli reached town, the story was already spreading. He didn't speak of what he had seen, but the fear had returned. The legend of the Mirror Children, which had once seemed like nothing more than a ghost story, had proven itself real. The next day, Eli left Hyden. The memory of the boys, of the strange feeling in the woods, haunted him. He would never return to Hollow Ridge. He didn't need to. The truth had been revealed to him in a way that words could never capture. As the years passed, the story of the mirror children lived on, but Eli never spoke of it again. Hollow Ridge remained a place of mystery, a land marked by silence and the memories of those who had dared to uncover its secrets. For the men of Haydn, the mirror children became more than just a tale. They were a warning, a reminder that some places should never be explored and that some stories should never be believed, until they are. In the years following Eli Foster's return from Hollow Ridge, the legend of the mirror children remained a quiet but persistent part of the town's folklore. Few men dared speak of it directly, yet it lingered in the shadows. As time wore on, fewer people remembered the stories of the boys who had once stood motionless in front of the decaying cabin. The town moved forward, but the land remained cursed, uninviting, and watched by something unseen. The local men who had once whispered about Hollow Ridge began to grow older. Some passed on, others moved away, but the younger generation had no interest in the stories of old. The mirror children became nothing more than a ghost story. But there were still some men who remembered. Men like Thomas Hill, who had grown up hearing the legends, but who had never once ventured into the woods to see for himself. He had always been too afraid. In 1990, Thomas decided it was time to face the past. By now, most of the town had forgotten the details of the legend. But for him, it was a story that had never left his mind, a riddle that needed solving. Thomas gathered his things and set out for Hollow Ridge, determined to put the mystery to rest. He had heard the stories of the mirror children, but like many others, he had dismissed them as nothing more than local superstition. The journey to Hollow Ridge was not an easy one. The path was overgrown, and the forest felt thicker, darker than it had in his youth. Still, Thomas pressed on, feeling a sense of unease grow with every step. As he reached the ridge, he felt the familiar weight of silence in the air. The woods seemed alive, but still. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the world around him had paused, holding its breath. He came upon the clearing where the cabin had once stood, but it was gone. All that remained was a patch of scorched earth, scattered with charred wood. The fire had taken the cabin, leaving nothing behind but memories. For a moment, Thomas felt a pang of disappointment. He had come all this way, expecting to find something, some trace of the boys, some sign that the stories had been true, but all that remained was the empty land. Then, as if answering his unspoken question, he saw them. The boys stood at the edge of the woods, just as they had been described in the stories. Their faces were identical, their eyes blank, and their bodies still. Thomas froze, his heart racing. The boys hadn't aged, they hadn't moved. They were just as they had been years ago, frozen in time, trapped in a world that was not their own. The fear that he had long suppressed returned in full force. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that the boys were not just a part of the past. They were still here, still waiting, still part of the land itself. The presence of the boys was undeniable. For what seemed like an eternity, Thomas stood there, staring at them. His legs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was pulling him into the ground. He could not move, could not look away from their identical faces. And then, without warning, the boys turned and disappeared into the trees, their faces fading into the shadows. The stillness around him was broken, but only by the sound of his own breathing, shallow and rapid. Thomas took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew it was real. The boys were no longer just a story. They were something else, something that could not be explained. He turned and walked away, his steps quickening as he made his way back down the ridge. The woods felt darker now, as though the land had reclaimed its mystery, its silence, and its secrets. The town of Haydn would never know what Thomas had seen that day. He didn't speak of it to anyone. The fear that had returned to him in the presence of the boys was too deep to explain. Some truths, he realized, were better left unsaid. As Thomas returned to town, the memory of the boys lingered. The mirror children had not gone. They were still there, still waiting, still part of the land. And now, Thomas knew the truth. Some mysteries would never fade, no matter how much time passed. The years would go by, and the story would continue to be whispered in the corners of Haydn. But for Thomas, it was no longer a story. It was a truth that had been laid bare, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The mirror children, the cabin, the fire, all of it would remain. No one would speak of it openly again, but those who knew would never forget. Hollow Ridge and the boys who lived there were bound to the land forever, unseen but never gone.